Welcome to episode 1 of the Silent Siren. I'm your host, Jason Demo. Today's episode is called It's Okay to Not Be Okay. Before I get into my topic, we need to address what is the Silent Siren? What is this podcast going to be about? Why am I starting a podcast, especially when there's a never-ending supply of podcasts available these days, and everyone is trying to be the next Joe Rogan. Who is this podcast even for? Well, I have many reasons I've wanted to do this for quite some time, but I'd like to go over two important ones for me. First, it's my sincere hope that this podcast will help people. I'll get into my background a bit more later, but I spent almost 9 years in law enforcement, and I left law enforcement in 2015, and to be honest, I was not in a good place mentally. I wasn't fully aware at the time, but I was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. And when I look back at my time in law enforcement, there really was virtually no help. There was no care or concern available or even offered for the mental well-being of myself or any of my coworkers, the deputies that I worked side by side with, and it simply wasn't discussed, that's for sure. And on top of that, there's a massive stigma within the first responder community. We have to be okay. It's not okay to not be okay. We must show up every day and go call to call and then act like all the stuff you see on a day-to-day basis, none of it is affecting you, and pretend like none of it's affecting you. It's the whole wash the blood and brain matter off of your boots and do it quickly because there's calls holding. And even more, you don't want to admit you're struggling because you're worried about letting your coworkers down. You're embarrassed to admit that you need help, and you don't want to get sidelined because your supervisors think you're crazy or something like that. There's people around you that are relying on you, and so admitting that you're not okay can jeopardize that. And what are my peers going to think about me? And so with the little resources that are available to first responders, and there's more now than there was when I was in law enforcement, but there's still nowhere near enough. But that coupled with the stigma associated with mental health issues, I sincerely hope that me opening up and sharing my story will help others. So that's the first reason. The second reason for starting this podcast is a little bit more selfish, and I'm sure I'll get into this in quite a few future episodes, but I do not talk about my mental health issues. And in fact, that has probably played a major role. I know it's played a major role in my mental health struggles over the years. I don't like opening up about this stuff, and I certainly don't like other people knowing about it. And for years, I've bottled it all up. Doing this podcast forces me to actually talk about these things and actually verbalize them and actually speak about things that I've never spoken about before. And I've seen many people suggest journaling and how it can help improve your mental health. And I'm sure that's true, but it's just not for me. I hate having to handwrite anything, and I've always had absolutely horrendous handwriting because I want to write whatever I have to write as quickly as possible and move on to something that's much more important in my life. And I've been that way since a very young age. This is also probably why doctors are infamous for having horrible handwriting. They've got to sign and fill out whatever they're doing quickly and move on to the next patient because they got to save lives. Anyway, I digress. This podcast provides me with an opportunity to verbally journal, if you will, verbalizing my feelings and what I'm going through, the wins, the losses, will no doubt be beneficial to my mental health. At least that's my hope. And back to my first point, almost even more importantly, is hopefully it will help others. So in helping myself, hopefully it will help others to admit that they need help, open up about their struggles, and seek positive ways to work through all the difficulties in their lives. And lastly, who is this podcast for? Well, I said I'm former law enforcement, and I have this passion for first responders and mental health, mainly because of my own struggles and the lack of help that's out there. But if you're a first responder out there struggling, this podcast is definitely for you. If you're a man out there struggling, I think this podcast will hopefully be of some benefit for you in the future. And if you're a woman as well, whether you're a first responder or not, I am certainly not going to claim to understand what you're going through and try to educate you or lecture you in that. I don't need to get canceled for mansplaining on my first episode. But with that said, particularly if you're a first responder, I hope that this podcast can help you, whether you're a man or a woman. But with all that said, let's dig into this first episode. It's okay to not be okay. Now, why did I entitle it It's Okay to Not Be Okay? Well, I am not okay. And that's okay. Well, why am I not okay? That's a long story that began back in 2004 or so. 2004, I went to the police academy, and I was only 19 years old. And I eventually got hired in 2006 by a very large sheriff's office in Central Florida. I was 21 years old, and looking back, I had absolutely no business having a badge and a gun. I believe for men, your brain isn't fully developed until you're close to something like 30 years old or so. Don't quote me on that, but it's somewhere around there. So yeah, it's probably a bad idea to give a 21-year-old kid a badge and gun and give him the ability to take away people's rights and go out and enforce laws. Not wise in my opinion. Thankfully, it turned out okay for me, I guess. I'll talk more about my career in upcoming episodes, I'm sure, but I'll give you a brief overview of my time at the sheriff's office. So my agency was very large, like I said. It had over 2,500 deputies. I think it's close to 3,000 at this point. But very large, and there were opportunities for all kinds of things, specialty units and whatnot after you did your time in patrol. And so I spent 2 years in patrol and was a field training officer for a short amount of time, probably not based on my knowledge and talent, but just because they needed FTOs. But I did my 2 years in patrol, and then I applied for our tactical anti-crime unit, our TAC unit. I was selected and spent about 3 years or so working in that unit. And if you're not familiar with like a street crimes unit, we were your typical street crime unit. Most nights our job was to basically go out and find bad people doing bad things and take them to jail. You kind of had the freedom, if we weren't working a specific detail, you had the freedom to work whatever you wanted to. So if you wanted to run guns or dope or traffic or do vice stuff or work CIs, whatever you wanted to do, you could kind of do it within each individual squad you were on. We had 6 different squads in that unit. We were very stat driven, and you needed to make arrests. If you weren't making arrests, there was kind of a target on your back, and they really wouldn't want you in the unit if you weren't making arrests. I loved it personally because you didn't have to respond to stupid 911 calls, and it was really just all self-initiated activity, and it was a blast, a lot of fun. Within that unit it ended up getting named eventually the Tactical Surveillance Squad. That squad was basically a small fugitive unit within the TAC unit, and they only worked violent crime cases. And I remember always seeing them doing like cool, secretive, fun stuff, and nobody really knew what they were doing, and they didn't have to be involved with a lot of the stupid details that we would sometimes get tasked with or whatever. And it looked fun, and there was like a mystique and intrigue about it. I was actually able to transfer to that squad eventually, and I spent, I want to say, about the last 3 years of 3 years or so of my career, and I was able to work around 200 or so violent fugitive cases. I absolutely loved it. No uniform, no grooming standards, no more marked vehicle in your driveway anymore, and we got to do a lot of fun stuff while taking very, very bad people off the street. And it was by far some of the most fun I've ever had in my life, and it was definitely the most fun I had in law enforcement. So that's a very, very brief overview of my LE career. And like I said, I'll talk more in detail about my career some other time. But I really just want to give you, in this opening episode, a brief overview of my mental health journey and explain to you why I am not okay. Well, looking back on my career, I don't remember a lot of things profoundly impacting me for the first 6 or 7 years. Sure, there was definitely horrible things that I saw, and definitely things that I know now affected me, but I really truly don't remember them impacting me much at the time. Like I said, I was young, I was in my 20s, I was having fun, just doing crazy stuff, and I just enjoyed it, and I don't really remember it affecting me. I don't have a single incident that stands out as the genesis of my struggles. However, I can remember a lot of traumatic incidents that I was on scene for sure. I would say around 6.5 or 7 years into my career, I started experiencing some issues. I couldn't sleep. I had insomnia every night. When I did sleep, I would have horrible nightmares and often have night sweats and just toss and turn. It was a major issue. I also really started to become extremely hypervigilant. And as a first responder, you have to be vigilant. That's part of being good at your job. But I started becoming so far beyond a normal level of vigilance. There is a very big difference in being vigilant and being hypervigilant. Hypervigilance is a state of being excessively alert and watchful, constantly scanning the environment for potential threats, even in safe situations. At least that's according to Google. But that absolutely described me and what I was starting to have issues with, and still struggle to this day. But I started worrying about everything. I was always concerned there was a threat around every corner, in every shadow, behind every wall or door or window. I would do all the typical cop stuff that we do. I would sit facing the door in a restaurant. I would always carry my gun everywhere, often have a backup gun on me. I always carried a backup gun on duty. I would scan everyone's hands whenever I entered a room. And this is all off duty, not just working on duty. I'd always, play the game of let's pick out who's carrying a gun. I'd just be at the grocery store and be like, oh, that guy's got a gun. Always know where multiple exits are, not just one exit. Always know exactly where I'm at any time in case you got to call 911. You got to know where you're at. All those typical things, but it really started escalating around that 6 to 7 year career mark. I still struggle immensely with this today, but I started having these hypervigilance daydreams, almost, I describe it almost like a vision or hallucination. I'm sure there's some scientific brainiac term for it. I don't know what it is. But for example, I'd be sitting in church and the wind would make the side door in the sanctuary rattle, like the door would rattle. And I'd hear that door rattle, and in my mind, it would immediately start to play out a scenario in my head. And I could vividly visualize every detail, almost like I'm watching a movie play. So that rattle was a man coming in the side door with a gun, and he raises his gun up and he starts trying to shoot people in the church. And I push my wife down and get her out of the way and draw my gun, and I shoot the guy and I take him out. And now I got to go up to him and disarm him and try to secure him. And I would see this whole process in my mind, and I would envision myself telling someone, you call 911, you tell them exactly this, XYZ, this is what I'm wearing. Make sure they know I'm the good guy and I don't get shot. Rendering aid, whatever. This entire big scenario would literally play out like a movie in my mind. And then at some point, once everything calmed down in the scenario, I would snap out of it. And however long that scenario plays out in my mind, that amount of time that scenario was playing out in my mind is gone from my life. I will have no recollection of what was going on around me during those moments. Like I said, I was at church. Often when this would happen, I wouldn't remember what the pastor was talking about in the sermon at that point for however long I'd been in this almost daydream, trance, vision, hallucination, like state, whatever. This actually happened a week or two ago when I was in church, and I randomly looked up and I noticed the bolts that were holding the spotlights in place on the ceiling in the sanctuary. Random thing to notice in the middle of a sermon. Nothing like stood out about the bolts on the lights. Just for whatever reason, I happened to become like hyper fixated on them. And then it happened. I went into this entire like blackout hallucination where the bolts came loose, the light came crashing down, landed on several people in the pews or the row below it. They were injured. I pictured myself running out to my truck, getting my med bag, and on and on and on. I don't need to play it out for you. And I can't tell you a word my pastor said during that time. So anyways, that started happening all the time. And I would say this was probably around 2012 or so. So like I said, 6-7 years into my career. Another thing is I started noticing my worldview started to shift dramatically. I became very cynical and people bothered me. I used to see the good in people all the time, but that started changing dramatically. Everyone was bad. And I could pick out everything wrong with you, but certainly not pay attention to any of my own faults. In general, I started just disliking everyone, even good quality people around me. I started assuming everyone was up to no good, and I started becoming hopeless in a lot of ways. And it got to the point where I was hoping people would start conflicts with me, not just at work as a cop, but also personally. Like I would seek out confrontation. At work, I started hoping people would resist. I was hoping we would get to fight the suspect. I started hoping people would run. If you run, I get to chase you, and then I'm probably going to fight you, and that excited me. That provided a rush for me, and it kind of contributed to just not liking anyone, but it contributed to me seeking out confrontation with anyone. But that would also happen personally too, which is even more concerning. Like I would walk around hoping my wife would say something to set me off so I could argue with her, and I was just angry all the time, and I wanted verbal conflict. It was not healthy at all. And I also started having random flashbacks. Something would trigger me, something I saw, a noise I heard, or some very specific smell. It would take me back to a traumatic incident that I'd experienced at work, and so that was becoming an issue. And one of the most important things that started going on in my life was at this time I began to self-medicate with alcohol. I didn't drink to party, and at the time I didn't need to drink to be social. I wasn't even drinking during the day back then. I drank to sleep. I drank to completely pass out and not have to deal with anything that was going on in my mind. When I would try to sleep, my mind would go at 1,000,000 miles an hour and I could not shut it off. And most of the things that I was thinking about were not positive or beneficial in any way, shape, or form. And alcohol helped me shut all that out. It helped me relax. It took the edge off. It helped me cope. But what I really liked was how it would knock me out if I drank enough of it, and I typically wouldn't dream. Obviously, we know that alcohol ruins your sleep in a lot of ways, but at least I was passing out and getting some sleep, so I felt like it was working. It was basically like a sleeping pill and a memory wipe pill for me. I loved it. So let's fast forward to 2014. And this is the year before I left law enforcement. So this is a couple years into kind of these mental health issues starting to manifest in my life. All of those previous issues that I mentioned, or symptoms, I guess you could say, had now been going on for at least a couple years. And I was at work one night and I ended up in the hospital. And I'll probably talk more about this some other time. But to give you the short version, well, first, I'll warn you, this is gross. It's nasty. Basically, I was on shift, and I had Chipotle for dinner. You can understand where this is going. Had Chipotle for dinner, and go figure, shortly after that, I was in the bathroom with diarrhea, or at least I thought that's what was going on. I started getting really dizzy while I was sitting on the toilet, and I finished going to the bathroom and saw that it wasn't diarrhea. It was all blood everywhere. I know that's nasty, but that's what happened. So I end up in the hospital for a few days, and after I'm out, my wife and I start having some conversations about how my work is affecting my physical and mental health. And long story short, we made the decision that it was in my best interest and the best interest of our marriage for me to get out of law enforcement. So I wrote out some more time. I forget exactly the time it was, but I had a bunch of sick time. I never called in sick, and you don't get paid out for your sick time. So I worked it out with my sergeant at the time. I started taking sick time like a couple days a week to try to burn some of that so I wouldn't get screwed out of it. But I did that for a while and ended up officially retiring from law enforcement in February of 2015. I'm considered retired by the state of Florida, even though I didn't do like 20, 25, 30 years. I know it's different in different places, but I was vested and I'm considered retirement, and I have a small pension from that. So I retired from law enforcement. It's kind of crazy for me to think that was 10 years ago already that I left. I will get into kind of my other career paths and what I did when I got out of law enforcement some other time, but over the next few years of my life, I would get very, very good at using alcohol to self-medicate. During those times, or during those years, I should say, there would be portions of time where I would admit that I probably had some mental health stuff going on. Maybe everything's not right, and I would admit that I had a drinking problem, and I was confronted about it from my wife at one point, but it never really manifested in a true admission that I needed help, and it certainly didn't manifest with any effort to try to deal with it at all. And I certainly wasn't talking about it, and I wasn't going to seek any type of professional help, and I was not going to have any conversations with people about what was going on. I also started developing antisocial habits, which was very out of pocket for me. I didn't want to be social. I started having extreme social anxiety when I did go somewhere. I didn't like crowds. I hated being surrounded by a group of people. So I started withdrawing more and starting to self-isolate. The crazy thing about it was when I did have to be social, I was very extroverted. I was very social, kind of life of the party. I was so good at faking it. And I really kind of am to this day, too. I didn't want anyone to think I had a problem or anything was going on. I wanted anyone that knew me, and especially people that relied on me for things, to think that everything was just fine. I was talkative in public, and I would have fun, always joking. Making people laugh is often how I cope. It just makes me comfortable if people are laughing and they seem happy, so I make a lot of jokes. Sometimes to my detriment, but that's how I cope a lot of the time. But to most people, I would venture to say that if you asked them, like, I seemed completely normal. People wouldn't know I had any issues. But inside, I was just dying, and I did not want to be wherever I was in public at all. Like I said, I started withdrawing and self-isolating. And then, weirdly enough, I'd be upset that I was lonely and didn't have very many friends or didn't have like a best friend. It was like this daily struggle of wanting nothing to do with being around people, but desperately wanting to be with people so I wasn't lonely. It's this wild dichotomy that is really hard to explain unless you experience it yourself. And I'm sure some of you listening can relate to that. I also really started avoiding anything more than casual conversations with people. I didn't like deep, meaningful conversations. I liked just surface level stuff. How was the weather? How was your sports team? Did you see what's going on with the election or whatever? Just simple stuff. I would ignore personal emails or texts or calls from friends. I'd avoid anything that I knew could escalate over normal pleasantries. I still do this today, and I will be perfectly honest, I am in kind of a season of that right now where I am not answering people that I should be answering in my personal life, and avoiding phone calls or meeting people in person or texts. And I know that's not healthy, but that's why I'm talking about this. This is something I struggle with. So I started really withdrawing from talking to the few people who really did kind of care about me, and probably pushing them away in a lot of ways. And it really wasn't incredibly bad at first, but over the past 2 years, it's become increasingly more and more severe. And so all my symptoms would continue to get worse. And then about 2 years or so ago, I started having additional issues that I'd never experienced before. I was tired 24/7. I had virtually no energy. Sometimes I would sleep for 10, 11, 12 hours. I would get up, I would eat breakfast, and I would go take a nap. I had zero motivation. I didn't have any drive. I was incredibly depressed all the time. I had anxiety about everything, and I lived in this constant state of depression and worry, which is a super unhealthy way to operate on a day-to-day basis. Like I said, this was about 2 years ago. I had some professional things go on in my life with work at the time that were just not cool and very inappropriate, and I was very frustrated with those, and it started affecting my mental health. So while this was going on, I ended up getting a service dog. I got Ratchet, my service dog, in September of 2023. So I've had him about a year and a half now, a little bit more. And he's been a tremendous help in a lot of ways. And I am sure there will be an episode about him and service dogs in the future, if not multiple ones. But back to kind of my health and what was going on. So I was working out usually like 4 days a week. I had a coach that was programming for me. I ate relatively clean, like not perfect, but I was in pretty good shape for my age, especially, for being in my late 30s. I wasn't obese. I was reasonably functional. I was drinking heavily and hiding that, but I had a lot of other areas in my life in check reasonably, at least reasonably in check. So I was still fairly healthy, I feel like. But I got desperate just because of how I was feeling every day. I decided to talk to a psychiatrist. It was becoming so difficult to function. I just wanted to see if somebody could help me. And so it turns out I was, no surprise, off the charts for depression and anxiety, and obviously PTSD. So looking back, unfortunately, her only purpose was to medicate me. I wasn't actually talking through any issues with her. It was mainly like, how did you feel since our last session? And then based on my answer, she'd ask if I wanted to change my dosage or change my meds. It certainly wasn't any type of actual therapy. So I got a little ahead of myself, but I got put on 2 different SSRIs. Even though I have always been pretty anti-medication. I do not like taking any meds unless it's absolutely necessary. However, at this point, I was desperate. I just wanted to feel reasonably normal. And they actually kind of helped quite a bit at first. I was much more functional, but I noticed I felt like I didn't care about anything. I didn't like the way they made me feel after the initial high of being functional again kind of wore off at the beginning. Sure, I was more functional, but it was mainly because instead of being depressed 24/7, I just didn't care about anything. I didn't give a crap about anything. It was almost just like zombie numb to everything, which kind of made me functional, but it made me just not give a rip. And so after a while, I realized the meds weren't really helping most of my symptoms, and particularly the sleep and energy issues I talked about. And I had a buddy randomly suggest, like, hey, bro, like, go get some blood work. I was talking to him about what was going on. He's like, you should probably check out your hormone levels. And I'm like, I'm not that old. Like, I'm probably fine. And I wasn't aware at the time, but apparently first responder life can severely mess with your hormones. First responder, military, shift work, nurses, doctors, things like that. It can severely mess with your hormones. And that, coupled with all the crap that's in our food and water and medicines and plastics and stuff today, there's a lot of things that can affect your hormone levels. So it turns out I just needed to go get some lab work done, and I found out my testosterone was ridiculously low. So I started TRT in May of last year, and that's another story for another time. But that decision has been incredibly beneficial. To the men out there, I'm not a doctor, disclaimer, don't sue me, but go get your hormone levels checked, especially if you're in your 30s to 40s or older. I'm not saying go to some TRT clinic and abuse testosterone and try to look like a bodybuilder. I mean, you're free to do that, but that's not what I'm suggesting. No judgment if you do, but that is not what I'm suggesting. I'm saying go get your levels checked because they might be playing a very big role in why you feel so bad all the time. I am on a low dose of TRT to optimize my health and hormones. That's it. So anyways, off my soapbox there. I got on TRT about a year ago, and that has helped tremendously, particularly with energy levels and recovery and motivation. And it definitely has in a lot of ways helped some of my depression and anxiety. So yeah, that was a positive thing, but it certainly did not fix my PTSD. So I'm not suggesting, hey, go get on TRT and your PTSD is going to be gone. That is not what I'm saying. So anyways, got on TRT, and then in the fall of last year, I decided I wanted to taper off my medication. I wanted to be off SSRIs. I was doing more research on it, and I'm like, I need to get off this. This is not healthy for me. I should not be on this. So I decided to taper off my medication, and I also stopped talking to my psychiatrist. Not that she was any help, but stopped doing that, and I tapered off my medicine. I was feeling better from the TRT, and I wanted to see if I could get the TRT to maybe help my mental health if I wasn't on the SSRIs. So I tapered off, like I said, and let me tell you, I don't know what heroin withdrawal feels like, but that first month coming off that crap was brutal. Brutal. I had horrible insomnia, worse than I've ever had, and I would soak the bed with night sweats every night. I mean, like swimming pool, just like soaked. I would literally just lay there in a pool of my own sweat every night for like a month straight after quitting the meds. It was horrible. But that subsided after a month, thankfully. But then my mental health started plummeting even more. I started thinking about, okay, quick disclaimer, I am going to talk about suicide. I know that can be a trigger and a hot topic for people. If you want to fast forward or skip this, I am going to talk about suicide. So just a disclaimer and a warning. But I started thinking about suicide all the time. And not necessarily like considering it every moment of the day, but it was on my mind on a daily basis. And there was thoughts of it regularly. And that had never been an issue. Like all of the mental health issues I had been having at this point now for over a decade, suicide wasn't really an issue. It became so bad that last October I had a bit of a suicide scare. I had the gun ready and I was considering it up in my workshop. I had just come home from a work trip. I was exhausted and frustrated with a bunch of things in life, and I was angry, and I was arguing with my wife, which was my fault, and it was the closest I've ever been to actually do it. And instead, I decided to pretend that I actually did it because I was at such a low point in my life, and I wanted my wife to hear it. So I went outside and I shot into the ground. I wanted to see if she cared when she heard it, and I wanted it to hurt her to feel the trauma of that. I am not proud of that. That is a very low point, one of the lowest points in my life, and it is not acceptable or appropriate behavior. But it happened, and these are the things that need to be shared. I am not okay. People need to understand that they are not okay, and it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to need help. It's okay to admit you can't handle it and you need assistance. These are the silent battles that we face. And I would venture to guess that almost nobody in my life would expect to hear that I had an incident like that recently. I was very good at hiding all that. And that's why this podcast is called The Silent Siren. So many of us, particularly first responders or former first responders, we have alarms going off inside of us that we silence. We put them on mute and we go on with our daily lives without addressing what's really going on because we have to work, we have families to provide for, there's people that we have to take care of, and we have responsibilities, and so we turn that alarm off. It's silent even though it is blaring inside of us, and we just move on. If that's you, I see you. I hear you, and I understand what you're going through. And I hope me talking about these things can help you in some way, shape, or form. So like I said, this was the fall of last year. I think it was October, like I said, and obviously my mental health is at an all-time low if suicide is starting to become a real concern. And this is while my drinking is at an all-time high. I don't like the comparison game when it comes to who's the worst alcoholic. I drank more than you, or you drank more. I don't like that comparison game because it's different for everybody, and it's not a competition that you want to win. It's not something to have pride about, but I was drinking at least 4 liters of vodka a week, at least. Mostly at night to self-medicate, but sometimes in the day. I wasn't driving drunk. I wasn't getting up and drinking first thing in the morning, and I wasn't drinking while I was working. I wouldn't be like drunk at church or at the grocery store or driving around. But I was throwing it back every single night without fail. And if I wanted to stop or thought I could stop, I couldn't. I could function in day-to-day life, but I was a high-functioning alcoholic. It consumed me, and I needed it. So a few months later, in January of this year, 2025, I was at absolute rock bottom. My wife, by the grace of God, confronted me on my alcoholism, as well as some other inappropriate behavior I was using to cope. I was searching for anything that would make me happy and that would give me that momentary dopamine hit. I was lying to her all the time. I had become extremely selfish. I was really a jerk to be around 24/7, very angry, and I was treating her absolutely horribly. And so she confronted me about my drinking and other poor behavior, and things really came to a head. And this resulted in absolute rock bottom for me. And I'm obviously not talking about a lot of details. That's more personal for my wife and I, but it was not good. And this resulted in me being at absolute rock bottom. And I spent some time outside of our home and away from my wife for weeks. She needed time. She needed time to process and to heal. I needed time to admit that I needed help. And most importantly, I needed to change my behavior. We're both obviously still working through all of this. This was only a few months ago. But one of the main things that I needed to change was alcohol. I needed to get sober. And I am happy to say that by the grace of God, I have been sober since January 13th, and I just celebrated 5 months of sobriety this week. I also finally have committed to seeking professional help, and I had my first therapy session this week with a therapist that actually cares and is actually solution-oriented. He is a former cop and specializes in PTSD with first responders. And he is going to be addressing practical ways to function appropriately on a day-to-day basis and come up with solutions to what I'm dealing with. I will not be getting prescribed medications from him or going on medications. And so that's where I'm at today. I'm in recovery from alcoholism, and I'm working a 12-step program. I go to meetings on a weekly basis. I'm 5 months sober and going to my first real therapist looking for actual help, one day at a time. It's a battle to stay sober every day, and it's a battle to exist in life every day with the way my brain works and functions right now. It's a battle every day to identify character flaws and work diligently to overcome them. It's a battle to eat right, train right, act right, think right, be physically, mentally, spiritually fit on a day-to-day basis. It's a battle every day to recognize behavior that is a result of my PTSD and try to identify that and overcome those things. It's a battle every day to admit that I have a problem. It's a battle every day to ask for help. It's a battle every day to talk about what I've bottled up for so many years. But here I am, talking to you, admitting that there's a lot of reasons I shouldn't be okay, and letting you know that I'm not okay. And I'm guessing that you might not be okay either. And you know what? That's okay. That's okay. I hope that some of what I said resonates with you. I appreciate you listening. And I'm looking forward to sharing more of this journey with you. It's okay to not be okay. Therefore, do not be anxious about tomorrow, for tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is its own trouble. Matthew chapter 6, verse 34. This is the Silent Siren. I'm Jason Demo. Thank you for listening.